Dr. Conditions and Teaching.
Human McLaughlin, I substituted in my MUHS.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. As always, I would like to provide, do we have any board members online?
No board members.
Wow, great. At this time, we'd like to provide opportunity for public comment. Anyone who would like to make a comment, please raise their hand. Joanna?
My name is Joanna Doria. I live in Richmond. I sent this all to you earlier today in an email to Mark, and I'm just going to read it right now for the record. Thank you for your time this evening. As indicated by the revised meeting agenda, it seems that you will be taking action on the Ripton SU. There has been a considerable change to the context of the situation, and I wanted to be sure you heard our perspective as you consider the possibilities. On August 25th, Secretary French went public with the unanticipated announcement of his current position to recommend that the State Board of Education make Ripton its own supervisory union. This was a drastic change to the original AOE guidance, which suggested this was not a feasible nor desirable option. In fact, here are two responses from AOE's legal counsel, both of which Superintendent Burrows was copied on. Although we do not speak for the State Board of Education, because of the potential district's very small size, we are unable to imagine a scenario in which the State Board of Education would declare a Ripton school district to be its own supervisory union. It is unlikely that the State Board would designate a Ripton school district to be its own supervisory district, single district SU, because of the district's small size. End quote. Moreover, John Carroll, the chair of the State Board of Education at the time, added, quote, as far as I'm able to ascertain, nothing in statute directs the State Board to assign a withdrawing district to any particular supervisory union, neither toward nor away from its present affiliation, end quote. The present affiliation he is referring to is ACSD. He says nothing about leaving Ripton with no central office support at all. Furthermore, we interpreted the following statute to mean it was in our right to disqualify it as an option. 16 VSA subsection 261C reads, the State Board may designate any school district, including a unified union district, as a supervisory district if it will provide for the education of all resident students in pre-kindergarten through grade 12, and is large enough to support the planning and administrative functions of a supervisory union. This Wednesday morning, the State Board of Education is going to ask for the opinion of all of the stakeholders in this situation. And your position will be reflected by the spokesperson of your choice. I'm guessing that will be Superintendent Burrows. Ultimately, I know my public comment won't necessarily change minds, but I do hope you may take a moment to really consider the option of continuing SU services to Ripton, even if temporarily. I also want to be clear about the possibility of real acute harm to our students if we are left scrambling to build a quality SU structure from scratch with such a short time frame. As you know, districts are starting to form budgets as early as next month. Although there are statutory restraints for the initial SU setup, our vision is to utilize 16 VSA subsection 261D, which would allow the State Board to waive any requirements with respect to the supervisory union board structure. Once set up, the process could be streamlined to mean one additional ACSD committee that consists of 3 ACSD members and 1 Ripton member that will collaboratively execute a modest amount of additional work that Ripton would be paying for. I believe there is a long history and institutional knowledge that will help guide this work. Ripton being our own district is one thing. We were working with that model only a handful of years ago, but the idea of being our own SU and one that is 10 times smaller than any other SU in Vermont puts our kids at risk. The ACSD board maintains their current stance that they are not willing to entertain the idea of continuing SU services to Ripton. The State Board could force that anyway, and more importantly, it could result in the immediate and acute harm to actual Ripton students. Whereas if ACSD did choose to entertain the idea of continuing SU services, it would only add a bureaucratic and administrative complexity that would not affect the quality of education of any current ACSD student. Also, please keep in mind that this could be a temporary arrangement to avoid short-term direct harm to Ripton students. And we would use the extra time to craft a more palatable, workable, longer-term arrangement that consists of reassignment or creation of a new SU that would then allow ACSD to continue their current consolidated structure. I know this is a lot of information, And I hope that it helps you process the change in circumstances with clarity. Thank you again for your time.
Any other public comment?
Is there any on here?
We do have a bunch of entries.
Any comment?
Participants.
Participants raising their hand.
See.
Yep.
Participants. You had the screen up earlier that, yeah. So in the public today, we have Poppy Reese, Tanya Scuteri, JP Reese, Ashley Lane, MCTV, Molly Witters, and Tim O'Leary. And we have Poppy Reese, so I will allow it. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay. I'm Poppy Reese. I'm a parent of an 8th grader at MUMS and a 10th grader at MUHS, and I'm here to strongly support putting up a Black Lives Matter flag at MUHS. Why? Because Black lives do matter, because people of color matter, because raising the Black Lives Matter flag helps us strongly say that we, the school district, the community, believe Black Lives Matter and are dedicated to being anti-racist. And as a district, school, community, and state that are predominantly white, it is even more essential to display our support. This is not about supporting the students who made this request, though we should do that. It's not about letting students share their concerns for a cause, though we should do that also. It's about the district doing this, because students pointed out that it is important to do. The great thing is many public schools in Vermont have already done this, so we don't need to invent a process for how to fly a Black Lives Matter flag at a public school or at a high school. Different processes already exist. Just look at the Burlington and South Burlington school districts. Not only have they flown a Black Lives Matter flag at their high school, they've expanded to all their schools. They also have on their websites tons of information about how it happens and what it means. They have a frequently asked questions section. Here's one bit from the Burlington School District, and I think it applies to some of the concerns about the Black Lives Matter flag that I've heard voiced at previous ACSD board meetings. So the Burlington School District says, shouldn't schools stay away from politics and be nonpartisan? Question mark. Yes, schools should be nonpartisan, but schools also have a duty to raise students that contribute actively to political and civic life. Schools need to help students learn how to discuss difficult topics with different perspectives. Black Lives Matter is not a political party. We as educators value civic engagement and are committed to demonstrating that Black Lives Matter in our schools, end quote. Or look at Essex, Mill River, CVU, Colchester school districts, which also have hung Black Lives Matter flags at all of their schools, not just the high schools. Mill River School District also hangs an LGBTQIA+ pride flag. Rutland, Randolph, Montpelier, Brattleboro, Milton, Missisquoi, and I'm not even listing all of them. So many school districts have done this already, and so should we. They did not all create new flag policies. Many of them had their administration join the students in asking the school boards to say yes to putting up the Black Lives Matter flag. And school board after school board said yes, unanimously. In saying why they put up the Black Lives Matter flag, they said things like, the Black Lives Matter flag, they is the school board. The Black Lives Matter flag is a powerful symbol of our work to dismantle structural racism, which is an important part of our democratic mission in public schools. I hope you, will say yes and put up the flag and do it with some sense of speed, and then do much more. Many school districts, boards, and schools have gone beyond putting up a flag. They have made formal statements, created anti-racism curriculum, held Black Lives Matter days and weeks at their schools, connected with community partners, and much more. And I will end with a quote from the International Baccalaureate Organization. They said, quote, "We wholeheartedly support Black Lives Matter. We stand in solidarity with the Black community and those fighting against racial inequality. We will continue to seek out ways to improve ourselves and our curriculum to inspire and create change," end quote. Now it is our turn. Thank you.
Any other hands?
Yes, hold on a second. Okay, Tanya Scuteri.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Great, thanks. My first comment today is relative to Ripton and the potential supervisory union that would serve as an umbrella over ACSD and the newly formed Ripton School District. While I agree that a supervisory union would add a layer of complexity, I do not see how it would dismantle the significant growth, disentangle, or deconstruct ACSD. And by no means do I see a path in which it leads to MUMS or MUHS left without belonging to any school district. We do know that Ripton students are likely going to end up at MUMS and MUHS. And with this in mind and the existing relationship that exists, a supervisory union that includes ACSD and RSD seems to be the logical choice. Every step of the way, I think we were all operating with the understanding that were Ripton to withdraw, the state would be assigning them to an existing SU or maybe creating an SU that would oversee ACSD and the newly formed RSD. This is in large part due to statute and direct communication from the AOE and their legal representatives. And for the state to throw a curveball of this magnitude this late in the game is an obvious and undemocratic ploy to hinder Ripton's ability to proceed and to dissuade other towns from pursuing their own withdrawal. I agree with the comments made by Joanna Doria and fully support a supervisory union that includes ACSD and RSD. My second comment is in regards to continuing virtual options for meetings. Given the current climate, I encourage remote options for full board and for committee meetings. I would much rather be there with you in person and plan to attend, but my son is a fourth grader in Shoreham, and we're in the midst of our second quarantine after 2 COVID exposures in the first few weeks of school. And that dovetails into my final comment, which is in regards to COVID safety protocols. I agree with continuing the mask requirement and would like to see more social distancing when possible and the utilization of outdoor classrooms as we did last year. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We have Ray Mason.
Hello, my name is Ray Mason, and I'm a parent of a excited 4th grade student at Shoreham Elementary. Or should I say, he was. For you see, for the second time in 2 weeks, my son has had to quarantine due to COVID exposure. And since then, his attitude and behaviors have changed because he is scared and lacking direction. I'm not blaming anyone for the quarantine, for the health and safety of him and his fellow students is of utmost importance. What I am blaming people is for the lack of preparedness and how the district responded to this situation. I, like most parents, am not foolhardy enough to ignore the fact that COVID is and will be a part of our lives for some time to come. But I was foolish enough to believe that the school would have an effective contingency plan in the event of a class or the school would have to quarantine. Being upset over the lackluster response and having to have my son quarantine, I reached out to Shoreham officials last week. In response, the school held a community forum last Thursday. From there were 3 points that came out that are of concern. The first is students that are being asked to quarantine are being marked as absent. Second, there is no option for students to do remote learning, leading to a less than robust at-home packets being sent home. And third, the school is not asking for written proof of negative COVID tests prior to returning to school and will take the word of parents. And yet, we require proof of health for regular vaccinations for entry into school and participation in sporting events. Not satisfied with this, I attempted to call the Agency of Education last week, Friday, only to find out that due to COVID, they are all working remotely. Now, the irony of this was not lost on me, nor the irony of this meeting also having a remote option. Currently, the AOE and the board are worried about COVID and are doing things remotely, yet the students are not afforded this option. Not one to let the lack of response stand, I emailed AOE and the Addison County Legislative Contingent to express the above concerns. Representative Terry Norris responded to all in the email, stating that I have a legitimate concern and deserve a response. Later that day, I was also informed that Virgins Elementary were quarantining due to exposure. However, this district had a remote contingency in plan and enacted it effectively. Also, their students are not being marked absent. I took this information and included it to my original email to AOE and the legislators. Still, later that day, I found out that the Secretary of Education was on Vermont Edition with VPR, to which I called in and spoke with him. I expressed some of my concerns. He stated that any absences due to COVID quarantine are to be excused absences for tracking purposes, and most importantly, any and all technological options should and must be used to support the educational needs of our students. So I'm here now before the board to express my disappointment in this district's lack of response in supporting our students. It is no surprise that we are still dealing with COVID and that we have had to quarantine. But the inability in creating an effective response to real scenarios of having students quarantine is shocking to me as a parent. The excuse of we are waiting for guidance does not suffice, given that another school in the county was able to be successful with their plan. I hope that my son will not face a third quarantine, but if and when this district faces another incident, I expect that there will be a better and more effective plan in place. And as for my son, we are doing okay. I thank the goddess that he has a strong and resilient soul, and that his mother and I are able to find ways to supplement this pathetic and lackluster packet of material that was sent. But my worry is for those students and whose parents are not able to make up for the lack of education these children are being afforded through no fault of their own. I thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Okay, JP Reese.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? Can you just give a wave or something if you can hear me? Because thank you so much. Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is JP Reese. I live in Middlebury. I used to serve on this board, and it's nice to see folks, even if you're sort of tiny on my screen. I hope everyone's doing well. I am the husband of Poppy Reese, from whom you heard so eloquently just a couple of minutes ago. I also am a parent of a 10th and 8th grader. And we actually did not coordinate these comments. So where there are similarities, they really do arise from similar feelings about the same issue. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude for the work that this board has done, especially over the past 18 months. You've faced unprecedented challenges, including the pandemic, local votes to secede from our still new district, attempts to create a unified facilities master plan, and many others. Throughout this time, you've made many difficult choices, which makes it all the more surprising that this board is having such difficulty coming to resolution on the easy choice of whether to honor SCORE's request to fly the Black Lives Matter flag at WHS. This request should have been eagerly approved by this body, and I hope you will quickly take steps to honor it. While the reasons for this are many and have been articulated brilliantly by my wife, I'd like to highlight just a few others. First, the strategic plan's foundational goal, 2, pushes us to ensure that all students feel they matter to people in the community. While the minutes of your last meeting suggest that there is universal support for encouraging a strong student voice, I have a hard time imagining that the students who made this request feel supported and encouraged, as you've been unable even to give a consistent direction to your policy committee on how to proceed. Second, I'm curious about what message we think we are sending to students when the International Baccalaureate flag flies on the MUH SS flagpole, but we are unable to honor the request of students to fly the Black Lives Matter flag. I have no objection to flying the IB flag, and I recognize that there are reasons why this board might choose to make the flying of the Black Lives Matter flag more complicated than flying the IB flag. but I'd want to underscore that this is a choice, and this board had the option to simply approve this request like so many districts across our state have already done. Finally, I note with some irony that tomorrow marks the 1-year anniversary of this board's adoption of policy C29, your equity policy. While the work that we all have to do around equity is daunting, the flying of the Black Lives Matter flag is a very small step that this board can take to begin to hold itself and our district, quote, accountable for building a district-wide commitment to equity. Again, I thank you all for your service to our community, your time, and your attention. I remain hopeful that you will remedy this situation, and I look forward to seeing the Black Lives Matter flag flying at MUHS.
Thank you. Any other online ones?
Nope.
Any others here? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Ruth Bernstein. A couple things. I'll try to be quick. You had a lot of comments. I understand. I want to be clear. If I were the only one who thought the things that I say here, I wouldn't bother any of us. But I talked to a lot of the community, all sorts of different people about these issues, and a lot of people feel the way that I feel. I also hear regularly from all sorts of community members, young, old, with kids, without kids, longtime residents, new residents, and especially even educators who work for the district. And they thank me for speaking out and for those of us who do this. So I just want to say that. Second point, I think it's essential to use all possible tools for public engagement. So there's no reason not to continue to offer Zoom access for board and committee meetings. Even if no one uses this tool, it is a step in building trust just to offer it. I also suggest an email group that you can opt into to get notifications of all meetings when agendas are posted and amended, which leads me to my third point about Ripton. Since I just discovered today that the SU issue is on the agenda as an action item, I haven't reviewed all the materials perfectly. However, it feels that the state and district are really bullying Ripton in an effort to make an example of them, to scare the rest of us into submission. I want to remind everyone that the district was charged with representing Ripton and educating the children, and Ripton felt so dissatisfied that they voted to leave. This is a failure of the district in achieving its mission, in my opinion. Ripton should not be penalized or punished for doing what they think is best for the education of their children. That's plain politics. Really, the point of democracy is for constituents to have recourse when they are dissatisfied and do not feel represented.
Thank you. Any other public comments? I just want to also, Suzanne, just note that Amy McGlash is. Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect. Great, thank you all very much as always. Next on our agenda is recommendation to approve the minutes of our August 23rd meeting, as well as the board retreat. We'll do those as two separate motions. So can I get a motion for the first one on?
I make a motion to approve the board meeting minutes.
Great, can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you. Chip, any comments or questions on the board meeting minutes?
Yeah, I have just a couple, and maybe considered the same thing. On page 2, I believe, of the minutes, it said Barb Wilson attended one of the in-service days. That was actually the ACSD pre-K to 12 welcome. I don't know if that matters, if it's kind of considered the same thing, that it's a very nit, you know. And I had one other item that pertained to me as well, which was under E, report of the board. And the comment there was Barbara Wilson asked if the board should just make a motion to support the Black Lives Matter movement. And this can't be voted on as we had not warned the issue. This didn't really occur at this point. We had already done the vote. And I threw that out not to vote on it at that moment, but something for us to think about. So I wasn't quite sure about the comment, this can't be voted on, because it wasn't something I asked to be voted on. And I would recommend that that came after the vote, because that's chronologically when I said it. I didn't say it before we took the vote. Thank you. But other than that, good job.
Suzanne, did you get that from an amended perspective? Great. Any other comments on the, Mary Heather?
Two specific comments on this. First one is just a word choice issue. In section D, report of the superintendent, fourth paragraph, the sentence says, based on current transition, and I think the word should be transmission, related to transmission rates of COVID. And then in section E, report of the board regarding flag policy. I guess at first, just want to acknowledge that the minutes are always great and thorough, and this is just a comment that may or may not be pursued, I guess. But there's a sentence in there basically talking about a lengthy conversation ensued around the significance of flags on the pole. And I guess I just want to express, I wish that this particular thing, given the detail in some of the prior sections of the minutes, perhaps could just include some of the main points in that lengthy conversation, particularly, and I guess the points that I'm thinking of specifically are the appropriateness of other flags on the official flagpole, the historic oppression of people of color, and the academic disparities between whites and non-whites, the inclusion of principal and student perspectives in that lengthy conversation, and specifically the student request for ACSD support for their position and not just the location for their right to express.
Sorry, there's no way. I just got everything you said. I can type, but I'm not a.
Well, and I think if we're going to get to a level of detail, then it needs to
Yeah,
be.
and I understand that, I guess, yeah.
It is inconsistent though.
Well, I guess, from my perspective, I guess, for a matter of public record, I feel like the lengthy conversation should be perhaps characterized a little bit for the matter of public record so that folks looking at the minutes can understand what was contained in that lengthy conversation. So I would just suggest a couple of points detailing. And I'm happy to send you an email or about the points that I make note of, but I also don't want to just interject my perspective. So.
Why don't we then, Suzanne, if we can go back to the videotape, so to speak, and identify salient points from the debate to make sure that the full debate is reflected there and just summarize them from a bullet point perspective, and then we'll amend the minutes that way. Is everybody okay with that? Okay, great. So what did we do?
We have a motion and seconded to approve the minutes, I guess, as suggested.
As suggested, they be amended. Great. Can I get a second to that motion? Second. Perfect. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Would I abstain because I was not present?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so I abstain. Great. And Amy has her hand up.
Oh, Amy.
That's approved.
She's a- Amy, could you put your hand back up if you approve? Thank you. Well done, Amy. Next, I need another motion for the board retreat minutes. And a second.
Second.
Peter, any comments on the board retreat minutes?
I just want to thank Suzanne for the great job she did at capturing what happened, the essence of what happened at the board. I really appreciate it. I think you did a great job.
I just had one comment. I think there was in the first couple paragraphs where you say about the equity study. I think you said Peter Burrows thought it would take about an hour. I think you meant a year.
details.
I'm remotely optimistic, but I'm not sure.
Any
It was like
other,
right in the beginning, maybe the.
Yeah.
any other comments on those? Great, so a motion to approve as amended. Did I get someone? So for Barbara, a second. Mary Heather, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I have to abstain.
Mary Gill abstains. Great, so moved. Thanks, everyone, appreciate that. Next on the agenda, ACSD bills. Dr. Malcolm.
Yeah, there's quite a few bills, and I'll go through them quickly here, but first ones were read on 8/30/21. It was out of the general fund. The number is $159,217.66. Second group was read today, and because with a change in business manager and the fact that over COVID times, we have not been reviewing the payroll warrants as we did in the past. We weren't getting them. It was felt that we should be resuming that. So there's a little catch up here to do that on payroll warrants. The first is the general fund, which is $797,126.67. 350,000 or thereabouts of that number is made up by the Visbit insurance 1-year premium, which comes at one time. So I point that out. On the, there were 5 warrants that had been put out, all of them read at about the same time. And I'll just, these are payroll warrants. And I had to go in and I actually asked today, they're done in columns as to which column I actually present. And it was agreed that I present the gross pay column. Because some of these are gross pays, some go checks which are directly deposited, some are checks that are written. So in any case, I'll just read these 5. One is for $12,770.53. One is for $817,206.02. One is for $2,142.93. One is for $821,890.96. The final one is for $1,475.88. Luckily, these get sent to Sharon when she, so she has those numbers to look at. If you didn't get them all, I can give these.
I think I got some.
Okay. In any case, I make a motion to approve these bills. I will say that we will then be reporting, in most cases, a warrant on payroll every time that we do the other, the general fund.
Can I get a second?
Suzanne.
Oh, okay, great. All those in favor?
Can I have some discussion?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So the bills came out today and normally I review them if I'm going to be in town tomorrow. So I haven't reviewed them. I haven't had an opportunity to review them. I'll be looking at them tomorrow. And being that the last set of bills, I actually found over $1,000 error. I would like to wait for this latter set of bills so that maybe at the next board meeting, we approve it, so that I have a chance to go in the office and look at them. Because one day is really not, I didn't know I needed to drop everything today and go in and review the bills for the board meeting. I figured I'd have some time.
So I'm the only one that has
So
residence.
you were the only one, because I thought your email said you were coming in today.
I know tomorrow.
So I didn't read it today.
So which set of bills has only been read by one set of eyes?
The ones
The ones that you said,
All of them that I just presented.
Yep.
Unfortunately, they don't get written if we don't approve them. So that means the treasurer cannot sign the checks, which are already waiting for her signature.
The payroll checks.
Correct. Well, I don't know about the payroll checks.
Those are still written.
They're still.
Payroll will still happen. Yeah.
Okay.
I just make that point. At least we had one board member look at them, I guess. And I had my questions answered, and I don't think we've ever delayed.
And from a policy perspective, does it require 2 board members to sign off on it?
In the past, when I was on the ACSD, we always had 2 people look at them.
Okay.
Before we wrote them.
Well, if we
The
have,
first time I ever read them in like 5 years.
if we haven't had 2 people look at them, then we can't vote.
So you want to, okay.
I mean, if we have to have 2 people look at them and 2 people didn't look at them, I don't know.
Well, I made you some, your email actually did say you were coming in today, I'm sorry. So I interpret that the same way,
I thought it was
George did.
Tuesday.
So it's not an issue, but I didn't even ask because that.
Prefer to do it because we thought, right.
Could we do a motion that says to approve them pending, a reading by a second board member?
Yeah, great. Let's do
I would
that.
amend that, I think it's a friendly amendment, whoever made the written chip.
I made the amendment, that's fine with me. I mean, I just don't want to back things up, and I don't, whether a board member finds a discrepancy that, because we found discrepancies in the past, and usually those are answered, if you have the ability to ask that question. So it's not like someone's getting $1,000 more than they should be in their check or something.
All right, so we have a motion to approve the ACSD bills pending the review by a second board member. Did I get a second? Suzanne, great. All those in favor? Any opposed?
Oh. I'm just looking to see that it does require 2, I'm looking at the policy.
And honestly, we've done this before.
Right.
Because at times there have been that the bills are read hours before the board meeting, and this gets to be a little bit, times there's a problem, you're right, but
Okay. All right, great. So approved.
as long as one of you reads them.
Yeah, I'll definitely be there tomorrow morning. Sorry, I had sent this at, it was.
Okay, we're good.
10. It's not at 9:30, so I was thinking the next day already, so my bad.
I would have made the motion if it hadn't been, if it had only been me that read them just as it was then amended. But that didn't happen, so.
No worries. Thank you all. Next up, report of the superintendent. Peter.
Awesome, thank you. I guess first thing I want to talk about is COVID update and kind of what's happening there. You heard one of the public comments about a few cases at Shoreham. And as I've shared previously, the guidance that we get from the Agency of Education this year has been very different than last year. We think we're really articulated and clear. And one of the examples of that is, and this is something that we've been working on at the central office level and supporting schools that this happens to, is determining how to keep learning happening when teachers may be sick, when we have 3 students out of the classroom, we have 6 students out of the classroom, the teacher's teaching the students that are coming. It could be 1 student, it could be 90% of the class, and kind of figuring out how to make all those pieces work. So we are continuing to kind of put structures in place to support students, support families as we're going through this, and staff as well. We did learn about a week and a half ago that we could continue with instruction and remote learning. And so we're right in the process right now of developing guidelines to determine if a student is present in the classroom, so that if they are continuing to get that coursework, that they're marked present in class for that. We're also working through vaccination. I know I mentioned at the retreat that we have been talking at the regional level about staff vaccination and requiring staff vaccination or testing. You all know last week that President Biden shared the federal plan about that. That is now, I think this week, we're probably going to hear more tomorrow from the governor and the agency. that 100 employees or greater, the OSHA requirement that's in President Biden's kind of list of things that he's implementing, we believe probably will impact Vermont because we are a statewide OSHA state. There are some states that fall under that category and some that don't. And my understanding currently, again, we'll get confirmation tomorrow, is that that may apply to us. So most likely that will happen at the federal level, impacting us. If that doesn't, the regional group of superintendents is going to meet again later this week to talk about next steps for a region in terms of what a staff vaccination requirement would look like. Tomorrow as well, another thing that we've heard about, contact tracing has been really challenging. It has not been as challenging for us. We are very lucky in Addison County compared to some of our neighbors in Chittenden and Franklin County, who I'm talking to other superintendents, and they're talking about hundreds of students and staff in quarantine, line lists, which is the list you make when there's a COVID positive, and you have to make a whole list of close contacts, are just enormously long. It's awesome at the regional level with superintendents, and just kind of problem solving together to figure it out. Do you want to call them people?
Yeah, good.
Thank you. So just listening to the comments that were made, so will we return to having like a negative test, you know, for someone that tested positive in order to return? Well, I believe we did that last year, right? No, we never did that.
VDH recommends not to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if in fact a classroom has a case again and you have to quarantine the whole class, will we be able to then have remote instruction via Zoom, that kind of thing, so kids don't lose instruction?
Yeah, the complication is previously when we were, the only other time we were in full remote was March, whatever it was, to the end of the year when we had classes going on and kids woke up, they got on their Zoom class. Because every class quarantine is different, it may be impossible for a teacher to Zoom with the 6 kids that are quarantining if they're also teaching the other 13 in their class and doing everything else. They would have to, you know, work beyond their contracted hours to do that.
But if the whole class is.
If the whole class is, yeah, we would have the opportunity to do that. And that's kind of what I was trying to say earlier, is that we have to kind of approach each one of these situations slightly differently, because it's not the same thing as the whole school goes on quarantine for an extended period of time, and there's, you know, that kind of planning. But we are certainly wanting to do everything we can to keep kids learning, and it's going to require us to be adaptable in each situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I just kind of 14 days is a lot of days to miss in September. And I'm just concerned about, you know, getting off on the wrong foot for some kids and not getting the instruction that they really need, and, you know, because we need this year to be better than the last 2 years.
Well, I think some of the concern around the contact tracing is, you know, the net may be too wide. I think is what I've heard, is that let's really kind of fine tune who the close contacts are, and not, you know, right now it's a pretty broad net.
All right. Do you have any idea what the percentage of staff members who are vaccinated? Is that something you know?
We don't know yet, but if we
They're not required to tell
you.
No one knows. Okay, but you don't have a general sense of how many are vaccinated at this point?
I have a general sense. I think it's about 90%.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about, just for her, like, public clarity around excused absences, like what's happening?
Relative to quarantining, or just
Go through it. Like, what happened if a kid is test positive? What does that child have to?
So when a student is sick, I mean, what we were told by the AOE at the beginning of school was, if a student is quarantining, you treat it as if they're sick, it's an excused absence. It's still an absence, but it's an excused absence. It's not unexcused. So that's kind of how I think most school districts were starting out the year. And when cases, and we were not the first district to confront a whole class having to quarantine. But I think we were on the early side. A lot of them started popping up around the time that Shoreham had its first quarantine. And we basically had conversations with the Secretary of Education at that time that all these quarantines were starting to happen to say, like, this is really challenging. And that's where we heard that, well, there is some flexibility in terms of approaching the, if a student is present or not present, if they're continuing to learn. And we had that last year when we had remote learning and the option of remote learning. We were able to determine, we had a metric. I guess this was in March to June of 2020 when we were fully remote. We had a specific rubric where if a student checked in, if they submitted something, there were certain things that would count for you to be present in class. So we're looking at bringing that back in the context of this new reality. But again, it's going to have to be applied differently. Before it was, you could control the day. And now, again, we're going to probably be in a situation where it's not going to be opening your Zoom as being present because there might not be the ability to do Zoom on the day if the teacher is teaching a class and there are 3 kids quarantining. So again, just kind of having to be adaptable to figure
So
that
the
out.
intention is to figure out some policy or practice in which a student who is quarantining could still be marked present. Details TBD.
Yeah, as long as we can make sure that they're engaged in learning
Right,
for that
and
day.
so all that has to be worked out, but the intention is to figure that out. And in some instances, it will probably be easier when there is, if it is possible, like the whole entire class is quarantining and the teacher is not sick and they could do some type of digital learning environment. That would probably be the easiest scenario to figure out who's present and who's not.
Absolutely.
And it's all the other stuff that is a little bit more complicated. But we're working towards that.
Yeah, and there's no, the concern that a lot of families have around absences is, there's a certain number of absences that lead to truancy, and we would never count these absences towards that number. So that's not ever going to be a thing.
Okay, great.
Yeah, but besides, the absence, it's also the richness of the learning is what I heard too. I think both of those were the concern.
Yeah.
And the second one's really hard. I know. Yeah.
Well, and I think everyone's on the same page if that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do everything we can to.
Any other questions on that? Yes, Dick.
So I just wanted to say that maybe I heard the community member statement about like encouraging more use of outside classrooms and stuff like that. And I just want to say that like I saw a lot of that last year and I was very grateful for it because not only is it nice because when we're outdoors we can take off our masks, but it's also nice because it's just the students like, learning outside. And I haven't seen any of that this year. I have not had a teacher use an outside classroom this year. Also, I've noticed it's getting a little laxer with masks. There's a lot of students who just have their masks like down under their noses frequently, and it's not being as reprimanded by teachers. And I just thought maybe like reinforcing the idea that like the students know that it's not going to be normal for a very, very long time. So I don't think we have to be afraid of that anymore. It's just like keeping up that idea that like, yes, there are other options that you can take instead of just trying to push everything to normal.
Thank you.
I agree with what she's saying about the outdoor classrooms and, I'm wondering about times when people are taking their masks off, such as lunchtime, and we're not able to socially distance as much. So I just wanted to raise it as just just a concern. I don't know what type of reply because there is guidance from so many different perspectives. I see this throughout the community. It's not just in school. The school is just a microcosm. I see it at work where people, it's, what do they call it? COVID fatigue, pandemic fatigue. But I think you made a good point about just at work, for example, we have to keep sending it out. We have to keep saying the same thing over and over. And sometimes people ignore us, but just remaining vigilant and doing what we can with what, socially distancing, especially when masks are off. And we only have a little bit of good weather left, making the most of this really nice weather while we can do as much as we possibly can to mitigate the risk, reduce the risk. There's, we know that there are certain things that work. So, and I thank you. It's really helpful to Kelly's updating. As a parent of a Mary Hogan student, I get a weekly summary from the principal, and I hope that people have access to Kelly Landwehr's updates. And, I just appreciate that we are doing as much as we are, but if there's more that we can do, then that would, we should just reduce the risk as much as we can. The other thing with the whole quarantining and absence that I wanted to bring up is the contact tracing. I think that families, the contacts outside of schools, the family is sort of responsible for that. And so I think that if you actually did the contact tracing, there would be far more students out. And if a family were to choose to keep their student out, even though they're not part of the quarantine class, there should just be that should just be part of the thinking, that there might be students that were not directly exposed in school, but they might have been that weekend at a birthday party, so that they, are also not, Mark Truman, or, might have the option of remote learning if they. What we don't want is families sending their kids to school knowing that they were exposed, because they're afraid of their child being marked absent, or, they're afraid that the child's gonna, fall behind in the classroom or something. We want to encourage people to keep their students home if they are aware of an exposure. So just my 2 cents to add to the COVID conversation.
Thank you. Any other comments? Chip.
It would sure be nice to know of contacts, how many of children who test positive actually test positive because of exposure in the classroom rather than exposure at their home. We don't have that kind of data, and I don't think anybody knows the answer to that, but it is, which makes it much more uncomfortable because we're doing a lot of things which in fact relate to school, but yet probably 75%, if not more, are probably related to contact with the adult or older population outside of school. We don't have that. I'm not making a comment to say we can figure it out, but
it's impossible to figure it out.
I know, but I have to think, I bet you a lot of it is related to outside exposure and not to eating lunch with your mask off with your friend. Maybe, but I bet it's much more likely.
Any other comments? Here. Anyone else?
Yes. So I've introduced Emily, I believe, before. And she's got an incredible smile behind that mask. And as our director of communications, she is doing an amazing job. I wanted her to just share a little bit to, I think, reintroduce you, because I believe you.
I wasn't here, so this is my first time. I've seen you all. I've watched a lot of your videos.
Yeah.
So I know some of you, but I'll just give a little background. I'm the parent of 3 kiddos that have been in the district or are in the district. I had two sons who went to MUMS and WHS, and I'm a fourth grader at Mary Hogan. Prior to this, I should say first, this job is going to be part-time until January, and then it'll be full-time beginning then. So we'll be ramping up. But prior to this work, I was an attorney, and I've done a lot of public policy. I've been a public affairs director, a small business owner in town. So that is a multifaceted career, but a lot of the threads and the through lines are around communication and really listening and really understanding some of the conflicts that exist below communication struggles. And also the flip side of that is I love finding the bright spots. I love telling the stories of other people. And so I think that this job offers the opportunity to do both. So I sent out a little update in your board packet, but the two main goals are really around engaging families and community members in the life of our schools, and also really streamlining and having some clarity around communications we have to do better service to our community members and our parents. I think I've been a parent in this district for a long time, and I see a lot of people working really hard, and I also understand the frustrations that exist here. So that is a real big focus, is really just being present for folks who are frustrated and seeing if there are some really good solutions that we can implement to make folks' lives easier. So the first few weeks has really been two main questions: what do we have and what do we need? I've met with almost all of the principals, which is wonderful. It's so great when you're in one school, you only really see that school as a parent. And so I love visiting all of the other schools and getting to know the culture there, but also really been listening for what the threads are as a district that really unite us. I've also, I think the on the ground stuff has really been around COVID response. I was trained on the website, and then because of the COVID cases, I'm very familiar with that page and how we communicate. And I think we all have different desires and levels of communication that we want in. So a lot of what I'm listening for is what works for most people most of the time, and how can we make information available to folks. I've also met with some folks like Shauna Lee, who's doing all the amazing SEL work, and Laura Lavaca, who started all of the food service stuff. I think those are two really good examples of some incredible stuff that's happening within the district that may not be as public yet. And also, what I'm trying to do is sort of build the systems and structures so that as we get more familiar with telling stories, those things exist. So social media is an obvious one. There are pros and cons of social media. I can tell you I've been doing it professionally for a long time, so I'm pretty familiar with those things, but obviously Twitter is very different than Instagram, and we are managing those relationships that way. But ultimately, I am in favor of being more present for people and offering more windows in. And I think that the last thing I'll say is that I attended the welcome and orientation a couple of those days with the new teachers and with the returning teachers. And I said to Peter and Caitlin a few times, as when you're inside, you see all of this amazing work that's happening. And as a parent, you often get little glimpses of it. But I was present with new teachers talking about how incredibly excited they are to join this district, and what drew them to this community, and how excited they are about their colleagues. And similarly, I watched teachers who have been here and staff who have been here for a really long time reconnect and support each other in that welcome, that day that they came back. And I think that there's so much that as a parent, I want to make more public because it wasn't present for me. And I'm just really excited to know also the students. There's just so many incredible things happening. And so as I get more comfortable and more familiar, I will say, subject matter in K-12 education is the one place that I don't have a background in. So as I get sort of more familiar with that and IB, I would really love to start turning over a lot of that communication to the students and start letting them tell the stories. So I'm excited.
We're thrilled to have you on board. Thank you.
That's it.
Wait, any other questions for Peter? Great. Next is report of the board. We have an action item on the position on the Ripton Supervisory Union assignment. The document is in your packet. And I'm gonna ask Peter to introduce just from a timeline perspective, how we got, why we're where we are right now and what has been asked of us by the State Board of Ed, and then we'll get into the document itself. So just kind of bring the context to people for this.
Sure, yeah, so we were waiting on instructions from the State Board relative to the 15th, and the meeting where they said they were going to be assigning to the Ripton SU assignment. We got an email last week from Oliver Nason, who is the board chair, asking us he asked for two things, one of two things. He said, either send information in your minutes or something that shows that you've appointed someone to speak on behalf of the board, which this board did in electing Mary, or forward minutes relative to the board affirming a position on Ripton's SU assignment. And that was the first part of his request. The second part was if a recommendation on what you think should happen to Ripton, if it's not going to your SU, so this went out to White River, it went to Rutland Northeast and ACSD, and to Ripton as well, to basically provide the State Board with a recommendation of what each group thinks should happen in the Ripton SU assignment. I've provided here a position that ultimately reflects the conversations this board has had, and I tried to provide detail to it for the State Board relative to what would impact ACSD. Personally, I don't think it's appropriate for ACSD to do the State Board of Education's work of determining ultimately what works best for Ripton. What I think matters to ACSD is what was talked about in May when this topic came up and this board discussed it, is the impact to ACSD and the long-term impact that becoming an SU would have to ACSD.
And so what we've been asked to do is, as a board, I said to Peter, I think during this meeting on the 15th, I think ACSD's position is best represented by the superintendent, not by me. But I did want to make sure that we are all clear and aligned from a board perspective, kind of codify what those conversations that we have been with regards to what we believe would be the impact of becoming an SU, going back to being an SU. And so this is the document that outlines what we've chatted about, as well as Peter commented, putting some specificity around that for the board. And I had agreed with Peter that it's not our job to make a statement or to provide recommendation to the State Board of Ed as to what they should do for Ripton, but it is our job, because of the governance structure that we have, to make sure that we're clear on how this is going to impact, what could potentially impact our school district. So that's what this document does. And so it was included in the packet. There were, as you can see, Peter and the team outlined kind of 5 key areas that we had chatted about, and then put specificity or examples and kind of added some additional language under each of them. So I'm hoping you all had the opportunity to read through this. And what I'd like to do is right now just provide an opportunity for any questions or comments to Peter or amongst us as the board members. But at the end, we will take a vote on a motion to approve this document as it stands, as it reflects the position of this board with regards to ACSD going back to a supervisory union. So with that, I'll open the floor. Any questions or comments? Barb.
Yes, did see that it changed, so I was able to read it before the meeting. And I also got a copy of the letter that Oliver Olson sent, which was kind of gave me some context as well. And one concern I have is when I read what the ask was, is that we were to identify the actual financial impacts. And I don't really see that here at all. It's more statements. The other concern I have when I read this is, I don't, it talks in this that we, the way we fund and that kind of thing would change drastically, and how the voters approve budgets and stuff like that. Just as it was in the past, before we came together as a unified district, MUMS or the high school, Middlebury, their budget was voted on as an entity. So ACSD, I would believe, would still vote on their budget and get approval for their budget. And I got the sense when I read this that that would no longer be the case, that it would add confusion. But the ACSD budget is going to be separate than the Ripton budget, correct?
There would be 3 budgets.
Right.
Yeah, there'd be an SU budget.
Right.
So you'd have to take a lot of what's in the ACSD budget would be drawn out into the SU budget. So the ACSD budget that people voted on would be different. It's analogous to previously when you had lots of centralized services and other costs in the SU budget. And then ACSD would have a budget similar to, your previous budget. Like if you're a district within an SU, your budget looks more or less similar. So it would change the budget fairly significantly.
For the services.
Yeah, for a number of the things that live within the SU.
Right. So I guess what I didn't get a sense for here is, and I brought this up before when we talked about it, was really what is those financial impacts and how much of an impact. And I still don't have a good sense for that. And reading through this, I see bullet points on a page that basically, truthfully point towards trying to really discourage the board from even considering this, as opposed to providing them some real concrete data that says, oh, it's going to cost us this much more. And
yeah, I believe it's less. I mean, my analysis is that it is less of a financial issue for ACSD than it is an operational and visionary issue, which is why the bullets that you see here speak to the impact, what the impact would be to the organization in terms of all of the work that we have moving right now, the strategic plan for equity, all these other things that we've got our arms around as a single organization. Once we become an SU, it might not happen automatically, but you've got 2 different structures at play. You've got a board that has statutory, authority over curriculum, professional development. So you've got the instructional core of the organization is now being led by the supervisory union board, and other things are meted out at the district level board. So it's just it's a very different, that is just a microcosm of lots of other things that when you create more of those structures, it's much harder as an organization, as a community, to come around a singular vision and move forward. There are lots of benefits to an SU structure for some communities that don't want to have a lot of oversight, that want to have more flexibility, that aren't focused as much on systems and all those other things. I mean, there are lots of examples of places that aren't asking for that. But in terms of what I see as ACSDs, and I'm thinking about our community in terms of what we believe in and what we value, and kind of pushing the needle on the opportunity gaps that we've been talking about just continue to stay the same. The more we fracture the organization apart, the harder it's going to be to get at that.
Mary Heather?
Peter, I'm wondering if it would be helpful, I guess it would be helpful to me, and I think it would probably be helpful for those who are watching, for you to explain perhaps what that structure would look like compared to what it is now. So like, give us a sense, like, you know, like speak to me as if I'm an elementary school student trying to understand how the structure of the leadership would work. So what would central office be central office for the SU? Would you be employed by the SU? Can you give us a sense of like how things would change so that we really understand like the nuts and bolts of the actual organizational difference?
First of all, I've never submitted an elementary student. Ever.
No, they sit still long enough.
Yeah, so the SU structure for the central office, all central office employees and central office functions are part of the SU. So you know, the locus is primarily that SU board. Previously, we had an SU board and we had an executive committee that was out of the SU board. The SU board previously was huge. And so that was distilled down into a smaller group that was able to make decisions about, you know, all of ACSU at that time. In terms of kind of how decisions are made, I mentioned before that there's statute that applies to ACS, the SU boards. Some of those things are wrote down here. Professional development programs, curriculum, grants management, special education, financial and student data management, construction projects, negotiations, budget development. So those are some of the things that by statute, the SU board would be in charge of. So there would be, in terms of looking at where we are now and what would be as an SU, ACSU with ACSD and Ripton, you know, things at the ACSD board level in terms of the things that are talked about would change. So you would think about, okay, what falls under the operation of the ACSD board as a district within an SU? So you would have fewer conversations around those things that the SU board is responsible for. The SU board may kick things out to the two districts to say, you know, please talk about these things at your district board meeting and then bring that information back and we'll talk about it and move forward. So that's, in terms of like how it functions, that's one of the things that's different. There are, you know, moving employees, being able to share staff is something else that's challenging in an SU structure. You know, the teachers in the schools are hired by those districts, not by the SU, unless they're centralized employee. Centralized employees are special educators, some of our kind of behavioral positions, the obvious central office positions of, you know, superintendent, business manager, et cetera. But, you know, those teachers earn seniority within their district, not district-wide. So you can't, there's not an ability to move around. Right now, if, you know, we're short a position, a 0.3 position in Weybridge, we're able to move employees around, maybe from Mary Hogan or from Salisbury, and kind of make things work. We are not able to do that in an SU structure. So that would be different.
So in an SU structure that consists of ACSD and Ripon School District, if we need to move teachers around within ACSD, that's not.
Within ACSD we can, because that's one employer.
But not within.
Not to Ripon or from Ripon back, yeah.
And the services employees are employed by the SU, not by the district.
Right.
And then in terms of what the board would look like and decision-making authority over centralized resources, how has that been shared between ACSD, I mean, can you talk a little bit about your understanding of how those decisions are shared and just the general?
Well, it operates as any other board operates. I think the question on representation has come up.
Right.
You know, so the statute says 3 for each district, and you can amend that. So I think it was recommended 3 ACSD and 1 Ripton. What's a recommendation for the construct of that? That doesn't meet the population difference, probably, right?
Right.
That was a recommendation by the letter.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just saying there are lots of different ways you could put that board together.
Okay, and then a follow-up question, if you would, Peter. Can you elaborate a little bit on the 5th point in this document?
Yeah.
The caution that this could ultimately deconstruct ACSD. Can you specifically talk about how that would happen? Kind of a.
Well, right now,
hypothetical.
this is
scenario.
barring any changes to statute, and who knows what's going to happen in the next legislative session if they're going to pick this topic back up. There's certainly been a lot of conversation about it. We had Act 46, and now they're like the state board has said this. In the meeting the first meeting we had. They're trying to make sense of the statute because it doesn't fit with the current reality of districts. And it's old statute that is unclear. They've had to kind of figure out kind of what things mean as they go through. But currently, if towns withdraw from ACSD, they have secondary school choice. So there's a potential that if more towns if there's an SU here, and more towns say, okay, well, we're gonna, now that we're no longer a single district, an entity, does it make sense for our town to continue to stay in the district? Like, what's the benefit to our town of staying in ACSD versus withdrawing and being a separate town district within the SU? I'm not sure exactly what would happen, but if Middlebury withdrew, if all of our towns withdrew from the ACSD, it's different than previously when we were in SU and we had a union school district that UD3 was owned by everyone, right? So it's hard to say what the state board would do in that circumstance, but it's just something that, is the secondary school choice piece is a concern for me as I think about the middle school and high school.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm hearing is that it removes the responsibility of member towns to continue to send kids and therefore send equalized pupil funding to our secondary schools. Is that?
Yeah.
But wouldn't they have to go through the whole withdrawal process, which wasn't an easy kind of, that was kind of a heavy lift, I think.
What do you mean?
Like a school couldn't just, like Shoreham couldn't just decide, oh, I'm gonna, basically be my own district. They would have to actually go through the withdrawal process and do that heavy lift, get all the towns to vote in the affirmative twice and that kind of thing. So, that could happen anyway for a particular school that is feeling disenfranchised. So I don't see this really making it any easier because the heavy lift is really doing the withdrawal vote.
No, but I think the concern is that essentially it sets up a scenario whereby member towns can decide, well, I don't like what's being decided at the district level, we're out. But we still want the benefits of being in and not the responsibilities of being in. And that's a real concern for me. That's a real concern for me.
Chip?
We've been talking about this since this all started. And this has been the fear, my fear, totally, as Peter was, talked about, is that a town leaving, or more than one town leaving, would then cause our district to be affected in a very negative way. And I think the state would be crazy to have that happen, because in fact, Act 46 was meant along some lines financially, but also on the other lines that we've utilized, which is curriculum and all the rest of it, to make it a much stronger group. Break it down, deconstruct maybe is the right word, I don't know, but I've had fear of this all along, and I still have fear of it. I think it would make no sense at all that all of our towns who voted to allow Ripton to leave, okay? Everybody who voted that way for many different reasons, not just for one, but who did that, did not expect that it would take a deconstruction to some degree, even if it's putting in a supervisory union on top of what we have. And I think that would be horrendous. I really do. I sympathize with Ripton for being sort of undercut in what they thought was going to be happening, but we didn't undercut them. I think we expressed, a lot of us, the fact that this was not going to be an easy lift, just leaving, but also setting it up. And we need to be that for sure, but I really do not, I support this statement, and I think it would be sad if this board didn't.
Other comments?
So, I almost feel like I'm missing something. There was this change in how the state responded, where there were initial recommendations, and do we have any background as to why they changed their stance on, it seemed like they were recommending that Ripton join a supervisory union. And then they say, and that it wasn't a good idea to suggest that they become their own supervisory entity, or even necessarily try to merge with us and create a new system of governance. So I was really surprised when I saw, wait a second, do we have information as to why that change happened at the state level? Because that's a really huge change in what they were recommending from when they started this. Were you guys part of those conversations, or I was just really surprised, and am I missing something, or it just?
So there's only been one recommendation coming from Secretary French.
Mm-hmm. Were the other ones from colleagues in the DOE?
So previously there was just unofficial guidance coming from Donna Russo Savage, who's kind of the lead in terms of helping the state board determine making sense of the statute. So there has not been, no one has known what the state board was going to do, right? I think we felt when we first learned that it was a possibility that ACSD could become ACSU. This was back a long time ago. We were told that it's unlikely.
That's the impression that I got.
But everyone is trying to read the tea leaves to figure out how people are going to think about this. But what happened essentially was, people started to try to determine how does the state board act in this process. It's kind of a first time, right? Like, this is not a well-worn path. The state hasn't gone through this many times in terms of this context that we're going through. There was about 2 months, I think, or so, where Ripton was in conversation with White River, and those conversations were positive, and it looked like that was going to, I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but it looked like that was going to happen.
I thought it made reference to 3 supervisory unions potentially that could be considered that were within proximity. At one point, it was months and months ago, I'd have to look back.
I'm not sure what the third one was.
There were just 2, but yeah, it sounded like, there are some possibilities here that weren't going to lead down this path. And so
right.
I was just, So both of those were denied, those potential
Well, both of those
connections.
districts said they weren't interested in taking on another town.
And it's their right to refuse. The state cannot say to that district, actually, I know you don't want to do it, but you're going to take them anyways.
The
Like that.
state can do that.
The state
The
can.
state
So at
can.
the end of this conversation, on Wednesday, the state board of ed is gonna have to say, here's the solution.
Mhm.
And it's either going to be one of those three. It's either gonna be, they're gonna go to a supervisory union,
Mhm.
regardless of the fact that the supervisory union has laid out a document similar to this saying why it will be challenged.
Yeah, no.
They're either gonna say to Ripon, you're going to be your own school district, or they're gonna say to us, you're going back to supervisory. One of those three things is gonna happen. Any other comments? Want to make sure we get everybody in. Peter?
As Peter was listing the central office sort of functions that would fall under a supervisory union, or he left out one which I think is very important, and that is the hiring, firing, and evaluating of the superintendent.
Oh, that's not that important.
I just want to make sure people were aware that that role is no longer the role of the district board, but it's the role of the SU board. And I just will say about this document in front of us, I support it largely because it reflects the conversation, and frankly, I think we took a motion or a vote previously before the state board process started. That just seems to reflect the position of the board at that time.
Any other comments? Barb?
Yeah, so since the board is obviously, they're gonna make the decision, right, based on the data that's provided. I'm wondering if in the event they decide it's ACSD, will we still have opportunity to look at what Joanna submitted and basically say, let's go for an alternate structure that would maybe be just a committee, as opposed to a full-blown SU. And it seems like that would eliminate some of the issues if we could do that well. And I'm hoping that there would still be opportunity there to do something like that, because I think it would make our lives easier on both sides, right, for everyone.
Yeah.
If we could come up with a structure that's really simplified and is more of a committee, and, you know, we're providing services, you know, for Ripon in order to do what they need to do to educate their kids. And, you know, I'd hate to give up that opportunity, because if we don't provide something like that in our comments, will they just make a decision and we now lost our flexibility? It's just a concern I have. Not knowing anything about the
Yeah,
process.
so I was gonna respond to the first part of what you were saying, but what, the last part, you were concerned about what?
That we might lose it, the opportunity to come up with this alternate structure.
Oh.
Because it says the board is the one that puts, you know, they determine, you know, what the structure looks like ultimately.
I mean, in terms of the makeup of the SU board, that could happen. You know, that would happen after, if the state board did decide to turn ACSD into ACSU, that would happen afterwards. So we would still have time to do that.
Okay.
But the thing that we would run up against is, you know, you can call it a committee or you can call it other things, but it's statutory. So the SU, you have to have the SU board, and it's statutory. There's no way around that. I did meet with folks from the Ripon board last week, and we had a conversation about that. We were kind of brainstorming, just talking about, you know, kind of what ifs and everything. And you kind of run directly into statute. Like, there's just, you know, unless the state board said, we're going to allow you, we're going to write a new statute, and it's going to look like this, and it's going to support this situation in and of itself, then I think we could do something that didn't have the same kind of impact and was kind of like what you're talking about, just providing services or something that is on a different level than what's currently in statute.
Mary Heather?
I guess I just want to follow that up. I appreciate this sort of option for flexibility and how the state board could work. And even the staffing patterns, I'm really concerned about the, the fact that this is grounded in statute and it will create an umbrella structure, no matter what you call it. It's an umbrella structure above this existing district and this existing board, and therefore does change how the district makes decisions, and that impacts students. And I guess just on principle, I'm having some difficulty with the concept of, all of us as board members are supposed to represent all the students in every member town. And I think this supporting the creation of a new governance structure that includes an umbrella over this board and this district, inherently elevates the needs of Ripon students over students in other member towns, or at least that's what I keep thinking, and I can't seem to shake that, and I just inherently have trouble with that. I wish there were another solution where we could easily provide services like we are currently doing, but I just, given the statute and the framework we're working within, I feel like Chip does. I think this is a real problem that does set precedents for other member towns.
Lorraine and then Victoria.
I just wanted to get clarification. We have no appeal process if we're told, sorry, but you have to do it.
Not that I know of.
I agree with Heather and Chip. I mean, I just think that seems very unfair. And although I definitely sympathize with Ripon's dilemma, I supported their leaving. I think everybody who voted for that supported that because they didn't want to be in the district. I think it's really unfair to tell our district that we have to become a supervisory because of their students.
Victoria?
I agree with I would be ready to approve the document, but I do have a question from Joanna's letter. She spoke a bit about timeline, and I wondered in your, and how that was part of the pressure of this, is that could they get organized enough as an SU in the short amount of time that they have. And I wondered when you met with the other Ripon board members, if that was part of their sort of problem solving, is that the timeline is so short, and that, if we, I don't want to change our structure, and I agree with what's been said about sort of messing with that. But if we were to allow for more time, I don't know if we have the ability to extend Ripon's departure, or extend how long they stay with us, to allow them more time to organize. I'm sure they're waiting to see what happens in Lincoln, Starksboro, and wherever else.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have that obviously is a state board decision to determine the timeline. Yeah, I mean, we definitely talked about that, and I think as Joanna shared in her letter, there's concern about how quickly, to do what needs to be done to be ready, with all the centralized services and everything, is really challenging. So, I would be awfully surprised if the state board wasn't looking at that, if they're going to stick with the recommendation. But again, like right now, what we know is Secretary French has given a recommendation to the state board, has solicited feedback, and that is now being presented to the state board. But my experience thus far is that has been, it's not linear. This process is definitely not linear. There are lots of kind of as Joanna probably will nod to, lots of kind of turns and twists. So I would imagine that will be part of the conversation, and I think, you know, what I said to them, and what I'd say now is that, you know, we would supporting Clifton as part of ACSD for however long this process takes to be ready to go. There's no way to, in my understanding, there's no way to provide services to Ripton outside of an SU, right? So it would mean, I think if the state board said, okay, you know, it's September 15th, and given X, Y, and Z, that, you know, by July 1, 22, we're not going to be quite there. We're going to push it to 23, knowing that there's other activity potentially elsewhere. That's a possibility for sure.
Okay, because I mean, I would much rather see them stay in ACSD for an additional year or however long than have our governance structure change. I just want, when the conversation happens, I want to make sure that conversation happens as an option.
I mean, one thing we couldn't do would be to become an SU for a year.
Right.
I mean, just the amount of work financially with this software system that is really not great, that the state pushed on districts, and it's not going all that well. That would be really like beyond challenging. To flip like that.
So I'm good.
When we voted, I can't remember, when we voted to allow you guys to leave, was there a date on that?
I didn't think that, but.
That's on one.
I thought it was July.
I thought it was July 20th.
It's this old statute. That's the fall of July.
Yeah. July.
Okay, so would we?
The state board could extend it.
Okay, I just didn't know.
All right, so we're gonna.
I have one quick question, I'm so sorry. Peter, are you aware of any other supervisory unions in Vermont that contract centralized services from another district or supervisory union? Like, is that?
Not outside of an SU.
Okay.
I mean, there's lots of contracting that happens, but I don't know of a district that's contracting with another district that is not
part of
the governance structure of.
I just wondered if it was.
All right, so I'd like to call this to a motion and vote. Could I get a motion to approve this statement as the position of the ACSD board? Chip?
Make that motion.
Second, a second. Lorraine?
Second.
Amy?
Amy from above.
Thank you, Amy. Any further comments?
I guess I'd like to know if we agree to this motion, that timeframe could happen, that extends it a little bit. Is that going to be part of
I
it?
don't think that's part of this.
We can't agree to that.
That's the state board. That's the state board.
You have no role in this.
Okay.
You really don't, other than being.
All right, so those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm gonna sustain.
Barb Wilson sustains.
Abstain. Yes, sorry.
Great. Thank you all very much for the discussion. It's appreciated. So that meeting is on Wednesday at approximately 10:30 every week. Correct?
Usually televised, right?
Yeah, so it's in that 10 o'clock time frame. That seems
They
good.
usually televise.
They do televise, and the timing sometimes is very fluid, I would say. Like, they say it's gonna start at 1, your portion is gonna start at 1, and all of a sudden it's starting at 11:30. That's where we are. So the last item on our agenda for the board portion is components of what we were going to discuss at the retreat that we didn't have time to discuss. And there's four kind of buckets of that. One is the facilities committee and the work that that committee is doing. And I know that we discussed that at the retreat, but we felt as if it needed to be a little bit more set in stone and clarified and a public record in the a regular board meeting agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. The second bucket is around kind of our community outreach policy and practice and what we need to do in that area to just bring consistency to how we respond to community requests or how we respond to community inputs and the roles that the board members have in regards to that in practice. So how does that work? We'll talk a little bit about board meeting locations, and then Suzanne had brought up at months ago, honestly, I'm not quite sure I remember which month, but months ago, she wanted to discuss, or it should be discussed, on turning this process into follow a consent agenda process. And so that is also on the table for consideration. So for the first bucket on facilities, I'm going to turn this over to Victoria to talk a little bit about just reminding folks what we had, how we kind of wrapped up the board retreat discussion, and how you see this moving forward.
Okay, I hope to have a little bit more information, because I hope that we would have met as a facilities committee, but we are meeting on Thursday for our first post-board retreat meeting. And there we will sort of hash out the priorities of the facilities committee that we discussed at the board. Those being the consolidation question, the sustainability, school choice, and
projects.
And bond. Secondary school bonding. And we will, I think when we pressed pause in the spring, I imagined that when we came back, the work of the facilities master plan would sort of become a full board work. After the board discussion, I think that the consolidation question and how we move forward on that, that warrants full board discussion, in part because there's so much emotion and whatnot wrapped up in that everybody wants to, and everybody should sort of have the same information at the same time. So, I hope to, in the facilities committee, talk about sort of what exactly that means and how we would move forward with the consolidation question. When I look at the other pieces, components of the facilities master plan that we discussed, we could continue moving forward on, the sustainability, school choice, and bonding options. That to me feels sort of commiserate with the level of board work that other boards are doing. And so it feels like those things could be sort of, the work could be fashioned in the same way that other committees are set up, so that there's work done at the committee level and then sort of the decisions and guidance or questions about guidance comes back to the full board. So that's my understanding of sort of where we left off after the retreat. Am I missing anything, or do we have questions?
One of the issues that fed into this sort of movement, as you described, was the uncertainty as to what was going to happen at the state. Okay? The uncertainty relative to the waiting, the uncertainty of whether the right is going to stay around, or whether it's going to be gone for a couple of years and then be reinstituted, or what's going to happen. And that was, you know, our discussions all along on cost have always been driven by a few of those things which came down from the state-funded system, regulated system. So if that's going to change a lot, I think most of us at the retreat felt that this was too uneasy, especially as you said, this is such a difficult and emotional issue when you talk about consolidating schools, not just from where the kids have to get on the bus, but from all sorts of ways. So
Right,
I just want to make sure that the context of it wasn't just that we were saying, boy, this is really tough, we're not going to do it right now. It was predicated on this. It's a lot of other stuff.
Right, absolutely, I should have led with that the question of consolidation and how we move forward with it and all came up exactly for the reasons that Chip stated, that it feels that the environment in which we're trying to make decisions has shifted greatly. And it doesn't look like we're gonna sort of see how it lies for a number of years. And the question then arises, is it responsible to make decisions about consolidating schools in that sort of environment?
And I think that that's important context to provide publicly as well, that given all of these uncertainties that we're seeing from the state, it's not realistic for this board to make a decision with regards to consolidation in an environment that is so fluid over the next 3 to 5, 3-4 years. You're not going to know what that looks like.
But we also acknowledge that the problems are not going away.
Exactly, which is why these other things are important to consider.
The same issues are there, whether there's equalized pupil number that sets a cap or anything else. Enrollments are low. They're probably not going to go higher, and it's how we existed this or even with continuing fall.
So that's the update then for facilities. Any other comments or questions on that? Super. Community outreach policy and practice. Mary Heather. So where are we with regards to getting consistency around how we respond and
Right, so we also have not yet met as a committee team after the retreat. We will be meeting next Thursday. And in that, and actually it's helpful to have the facilities team meet beforehand so that we have a sense of what kind of communication work and tasks need to be done from a facilities perspective so that we, as the communications team, can talk about that as well. So there's two things. One, and the agenda for our next committee meeting includes first, just kind of the routine communications that we're hoping to support the board. So what we want to do is talk about some of the things that we had mentioned at the board retreat. How about doing a newsletter? If so, what would that look like? How would we make that a sustainable thing? What are some of the outlets we might put it in so that we can bring it to the board, say, here's what we're proposing.
so you could plan then is for those things to come back to the board after the break.
Yes,
okay.
and then specifically around facilities tasks, that's sort of to be determined depending on what the facilities committee decides are next steps. Because obviously those next steps would then need to be conveyed somehow to the community so that folks know what's happening, and secondly, have an opportunity to participate in whatever steps are being taken.
Great. And then one of the things that arose over the past couple of weeks, Barb Wilson had the opportunity, was asked by constituents to talk about the retreat, provide a debrief, and that opportunity was presented was posted to be presented on a Facebook page that was, and I might get this linguistically incorrect, but it was a Facebook page that was Save Shoreham Schools, or I believe that was the title of the page.
Keep Shoreham
Open. Great. And so then that was brought to my attention as to, is this the way that this should happen in board communication? How does this work? And so Barb and I chatted and said, from a perception perspective, here's the things that has been shared with me that are a concern. Barb then reached out to the Vermont School Boards Association, and they also recommended that if there were, they also say that there was going to be some perception challenges and it was probably best not to do it that way. And so then a couple folks reached out to me on the board and said, how are we as a board presenting ourselves to the community and providing constituents the opportunity to share or have access and et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that I think we have to get clarity around is what is that process going to be? And how do we, from a policy and practice perspective, provide an environment that our constituents feel as if they have access to, there can be dialogue, but also make sure that, as our board policy states, that we speak publicly only as one voice when the board provides approval for an individual to speak on behalf of the board. Otherwise, we are speaking as individuals.
Sure.
And how do we make sure that that is appropriately communicated and assumed in all types of communication? And then finally, as we have been working really hard, how do we make sure that we're always sending a message? We represent the entire district. We don't represent a specific town. And so how do we make sure that the things that we do are inclusive of all constituents, not just of those constituents in which where we live, the town we live in. So that's something that I think between policy and communication, we just need to get some clarity around.
Yeah. And I guess the question is, we had put together, just in response to a lot of the public input we've been getting, mostly through email in the early spring, just kind of how to respond to that. And we had the communications committee had put together just a sort of draft procedure document and shared that with the policy committee. I'm wondering if the board would like the communications committee to, similarly draft a procedure document for, how do we, what's the process or what's the system that we're going to use for sort of public engagement, public outreach. So if someone, for example, says, hey, can you meet with our small group? What's the process? What's the decision making that happens around that? Do we always need to bring it to the board? Is there, I guess I'm just wondering if the board would like some kind of written guidance on that we can then give to the policy committee and or bring to the full board to just say, yes, this makes sense. This is how we want to do it as a group. These are the circumstances under which we would prefer to send the board chair as our, spokesperson, or these are the circumstances under which we're comfortable having a member just meet with, a parent group or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for this topic, right? I think it's an important one.
Yeah.
I think, absolutely we represent the whole district, and believe it or not, because of, my market and all this kind of stuff, I really talk to people across the district, right? As far as they come by my booth, that kind of thing. I think any policy we put together, people feel comfortable maybe expressing concerns to certain individuals, and they should feel, I believe they should be able to do that. And I think it's very important that obviously an individual doesn't represent the board in any means, but I believe part of our role is to be the voice for the community too. And so if you have a good dialogue with people, and they, like tonight, right, I had some input about frustration about the quarantine and that kind of thing, and I felt like I could also bring that forward. And I think I don't want to in any way sever that communication, because I think it's very important that people feel like they can come to me and I'll take it serious and I will bring it forward, right? And help be the voice, right? But I absolutely agree that in no way, shape, or form, any one of us represent the board and must dictate it. And so obviously we have to have something, very stringent around that. But I don't want us to lose that flexibility, because it can be just standing on the street corner, a couple of people coming up at the co-op or any number of places and, asking a question about are saying, hey, I have a situation, whatever, and, you know, I would love them to be able to feel that they can share that with me.
Chip.
There was one other thing that we talked about too, as far as the communication, and it was certainly, that the idea, especially in these days of email and, things like that, as to how that gets designated for response if necessary. Other than having the board chair be the only person who can respond to if there is a point where you get lots of emails that no one is responding to. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't think it's fair to burden everybody or to one person, but I think that was a complaint relative to your communication from the public at times, that they weren't responded to. I'm not talking about public comment, because in actual fact, it's not a forum for response, okay? But an email is directed to the board. It could be, we received your email, thank you. Or,
Right now, at least on one of the specific issues with regards to the flag policy, the communications committee has established a response that when a question comes into the full board on that, Mary Heather has been responding with that response.
okay.
So everybody,
Well, as long as we have a,
yeah, so I think we're all, they're working.
we should know a little bit, us as other board members, because other board members have expressed that concern at times when they haven't been responding.
Yeah.
So it'd be nice to know what is being said, right? So.
Mary Heather, you've replied all.
She's replied all.
So I'm gonna, we need to go back to calling on people and
Yeah.
talking about that.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Mary Heather,
Well, what I was gonna say for specifically the emails with respect to the flag policy, I had copied the board chair and assistant chair and the policy chair. I had not replied all, but I certainly can. And, you know, I feel a little bit uncomfortable because we haven't officially kind of adopted this proposed procedure document, but I also am very uncomfortable leaving people hanging and hearing critics from the board as an entity. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, what's the best way to move forward?
It's challenging, I mean, we've been in this new world for a long time, but you know, just because somebody asks a question, are we obligated to answer it in a timely fashion beyond saying we acknowledge receipt of what you've sent in? Because it can become overwhelming as we, you know, back when I was board chair and we were dealing with the school consolidation question, there were a lot of emails coming in. So what we ultimately did was create the frequently asked questions page, which was very helpful. But that aside, if we're going to go down this path of creating a policy and procedure, I would definitely solicit other school districts to see how they handled it, because you know there's a certain, you know, we are sort of answerable to our colleagues on the board, and we're also not necessarily answerable to our colleagues on the board because we were elected by the people. So need to find that right balance in a policy and a procedure.
Great.
Just some historic perspective. Back in February and March, the policy committee was actually looking at this. And for one reason or another, we didn't finish our process because the communication committee was really getting up to speed and they were doing a lot of things. So I think the time is, you know, this is the time to really kind of get that under our belt, how we're going to do that. But we started looking at what other districts had done. And I think everybody feels like we do need to let constituents know we're hearing them, but not necessarily, but I think your procedure idea is a really good idea. So.
Great, so your two worlds are then going to move this forward. Perfect, and in the meantime, for the flag policy conversations, I think the response that has been returned to them is appropriate. Suzanne, and then Lindsay, and then Victoria.
Related to that, well, second what Mary said, we had already started, found like 3 or 4 other policies that were around community engagement and how to respond to things. But there is, for some of the comments that we get or some of the letters, there is a standing order of protocol that if somebody, for some reason, I seem to get the letters of
there's something going on with my child in a certain school or blah, blah, blah. And I always respond back to them as the protocol is, reach out to the teacher. That's where it starts, and then follow the chain of command. And I always copy Peter on it so that he knows what I said. But I always refer him back to that. And then, and that's very standard operating procedure. They have to know that, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Lindsay.
I'm looking forward to this, working this out because I too have received these and I want to reply, but I don't feel like I should yet because I don't know something as simple as, do I reply all or do I just reply? Who do I copy?
Yeah.
And like, I didn't realize that Mary Heather had replied. So I'm here thinking, nobody's replied. Should I just say, thanks for the email? See you at the co-op? I just, so, even something as, without outlining like a whole procedure, just like the nuts and bolts of it, like, it would have been nice to know that you had replied, because I'd be like, phew, okay, that's, without getting into the nitty gritty, I agree that we should reply, but some of these are very thoughtful. The person might have spent half a day composing this communication, and I feel like it's not the right thing to do to just ignore it, which I haven't been ignoring it, but it's like, I don't want to say the wrong thing and.
Yeah, totally get it. So we'll fast track kind of the response strategy. Yeah.
Just a quick little bit of history. At one time it was our policy, or not policy, our procedure, and still stands, where we sort of set a blanket that if it's an email to the whole board, the chair will have the responsibility to respond, even if it's just an acknowledgement of receipt, or designate somebody to do that. So it was a way to make all of us know that even though maybe we didn't see the response, but that it was responded to.
Okay. Yeah, because we live in a small community. And so you see some of these people who have written in, like I've seen them since they've written it, and it's like, oh, so, yeah. So
And I think in general, at least it's been my experience, everybody's trying to do the right thing here. And when people are sending emails and the expectation of response times differ for a lot of different people. And so how do you meet people where they're at and yet still operate in as efficient way as possible with everything going on? Any other comments on that? Great. So thank you all, Mary, Heather, and Mary Gill, for moving that forward. Board meeting locations. So right now we're scheduled full out, correct, for the rest of the year?
We are, yeah.
We are.
We
And that
start
includes
next month at Mary Hogan.
in October, that's the first, yes, I think it's, I forget the date, but it's the first meeting in
First meeting in
October
October, yeah.
is out of school. And we'll continue that rotation as we have in the past, where it's every other. And I think the question is how are we going to, from a logistics perspective, when we are at these other schools where the technology is very different, the setup is very different, what will be the appropriate expectation placed on those elementary schools to support a Zoom call for those meetings?
So Will and I talked about that. Will, do you want to?
Sure. So this device is pretty easy to pack up and bring someplace else. I think the big thing is it's going to be, the size of the room.
Yeah.
And, whether or not it's going to, the way that the board sets up in that space, whether or not it's going to really be able to pick up the audio. We've already learned from this device, the camera is not all that great, but I think people really want to hear it, probably a little bit more than they're concerned with seeing perfectly. We always have the plan B, which is the good video camera. And I could see that if we were in a place where the board maybe was at sort of a one long table, like I've seen it before, rather than in a circle, if I was kind of behind the audience pointing the other camera, it might work out a little bit better. So I think I'm going to have to look at each individual space and try to figure out what the best thing to do is. as far as getting, internet and packing up equipment and stuff, I'm not concerned about that. I'll bring whatever I have to all of the different spaces, but it's really just gonna depend on the space. So
Okay.
I'll make it available. And hopefully, it's every bit as good as it's been here, but.
And I think the only thing that I would ask is we set appropriate expectations that it's not gonna be perfect. And to place a requirement on you to figure out in a multitude of elementary schools how we can get perfect audio for everyone, I don't think that that's the best use of his time, to be quite honest. And so I just want to make sure that there could be a day where the sound's not going to be great. And we're going to have to be okay with that as a board, that we're doing everything we can to make the sound as best as we can. But these are very different environments with big, you're in a gymnasium in some of these places with echoing up to, that's the worst place to try to capture audio. And so I just worry that it's gonna, fall short sometimes, and we gotta be okay with that.
This device is really designed for a space this big, or perhaps even like a boardroom, where you put it in the middle of a table. So, in a place like a gym or a cafeteria, it could be a little challenging.
Yeah.
It's where we might need the other setup, but been practicing for a couple of years, so.
Well, we'll problem solve with each school too. We may, instead of being in, like, I can think of some places where Mary Hogan, for example, we've been in the gym previously. We could potentially move into the music room or another large space that might work better.
Great, Lindsay?
Could we use microphones, like pass the microphone to who's speaking, or have like 2 or 3 of them, so that there's not a delay or a slowdown of the meeting? Like just an old school microphone? Do we have those?
We'd be better off with the good video camera on the tripod, with a shotgun microphone, because that is super high sensitivity.
Okay.
And if you, like in the MUHS gym, we recorded the students performing in there from the other end of the gym, and it picks it up really well.
Are they mic'd when the?
No.
No, it's just, okay.
But yeah, so in the past, Middlebury Community TV actually came to the meetings. And they always did a good job. I've listened to them and they were able to do that. So I think now they do the Zoom, so they don't have to physically go there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a lot easier for them. So at some point, for at least the board meeting, we had that backup, which was in, the Middlebury Community TV. So if there was a problem area, they could come in person like they used to occasionally. If
things to exist, and it seems as if that's working okay. So we don't seem to need to go back to everything having to be in before the board meeting. Are you?
I honestly didn't like before the board meeting. I thought it was rushed and fragmented. And I don't think it was as productive as when we had to work it out, albeit it's not as efficient in setting it up.
Yeah.
Because we're all gonna be here supposedly, but I didn't think it.
And if it gets arduous for the committee chairs to do the setup process, which is, that is probably the worst part of it all, is the back and forth on emails. Let us know, let Peter and I know, and we'll figure out if there's an easier tool or way that we can go about doing that. Okay?
I was just gonna say that, I mean, I think at our meeting on Thursday, we'll discuss whether or not we just wanna set, you know, a Thursday at noon or whatever it is, every other week or something like that, so we may.
Right. Well, you can do that, that's fine.
Yeah, great. So you got, everybody will forge ahead and make that possible.
I just was wondering whether we have a similar expectation for providing Zoom.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay,
Sorry.
That's my question.
All right, so you guys do, everyone's gonna forge ahead with setting the meeting dates. The next issue is whether or not we're providing remote access to committee meetings, which prior to COVID, we did not do the full, that experience was different than what the video experience would be like for a board meeting. During COVID, that changed and we provided more access to our Zoom meetings, through Zoom meetings to committee meetings. So we'd like to open it up for discussion on how folks feel about committee meetings and the remote access and management of that. Barb.
Hi. I think it's really great that committees have the flexibility to be able to schedule it when's the best time for the committee. But with that said, that like in here in the middle of the day interferes with when community members can really participate because they may be at work and that kind of thing. So having the Zoom and the recording so people can maybe at lunch dial into it. They might be working in their gyms or somewhere further away, be able to spend their lunch just listening to what the committee's doing or provide public comments. And then if they can't catch the whole thing, having something to go back and look at, I think would just really be awesome for people. It just makes us really more transparent and accessible to everybody. So that would be my thought.
Other comments on committee?
I mean, you know, it'd be lovely. I just worry about our stretching of resources, especially Will and his team's resources to sort of make all that happen in a way that sort of conforms to how it should be done. You know, I think we are continually trying to do our best. And Mary's comment about our, you know, setting expectations to be realistic is there. I mean, we can't do everything perfectly all the time due to resource limitations.
Chip.
I agree with Peter completely on that. Much of what happens in committee is we don't make a decision. All we do is discuss the issues which we will eventually bring to the board. So the public's involvement can come from reading the minutes, okay? They aren't involved with the committee itself, observing what's going on. And if we're doing it in person, then I think they have the obligation to come, or they can come to the meeting. That's happened before. It just seems that over the last few years, we've had people at committee meetings at times where it was 50 years before that, no one ever wanted to come to a committee meeting.
That's good.
So I think that, Barb, you're right about having that option for people who want to be involved, but I think Peter's point, I think it gets to be overwhelmingly difficult to try to provide adequate Zoom observation, because that they aren't necessarily going to take part in any decision. It's just a matter of listening to it. So.
Right.
I agree. I found that Zooming constituents or community members in, it's nice, but it really delays us getting to our agenda, and our meeting, because we may go an hour and a half to 2 hours because we had to add in, quite a bit of conversation from the community. I'd rather put the agenda out, let people send us information if they want, and then watch the recording, and then get back to us again. I just feel like it complicates the process, and we're so limited in our time when the committee can meet. I'd like to just record it and let them see it, and we'll send the agenda and the notes out, and they can always get back to us. Like Chip said, we're not making any major decisions, we're discussing. So.
Victoria, did you have any?
If we're gonna record it, then wouldn't it, how would we be recording it? Like, if we're not zooming it, then what other method would we use to record it?
We're recording the conversation. I don't know, well, how would we record it?
I mean,
Well, you could do a Zoom and record it,
like a seminar instead of a meeting?
you can record even in a regular Zoom meeting. So, if we were gonna do that, perhaps it's not that much more difficult to actually let people watch it, but,
Right.
I don't know, have they been recorded in the past, and has that been made available?
Yes.
Yep.
How did they do that?
So in the past, for the communications committee, usually it was a central, like in the past, it was Erica who hosted the Zoom meeting and recorded it, and then it was available. The recording was posted, and this was a COVID thing, because folks couldn't physically show up. So that was the way that folks could show up and make comments, and the recording was posted alongside the meeting minutes on the website. And I guess the question is, what is the expectation moving forward? Because I agree with, but I don't think that we should burden central office staff with these things. This is board responsibility. So if it's easy for you as a board member to host a meeting and Zoom and do all that, great. But otherwise, I too am reluctant to burden our IT staff, who already has a lot on their plate. So,
And I do think we have to be consistent.
Yeah.
And so, I would probably be inclined to say committee meetings, like all meetings, are public meetings. If folks want to attend in person, they can. The minutes will be taken, and then because there is no action being taken at those meetings, those minutes can then be reviewed by constituents, and then they can ask questions or make public comment with regards to that during a board meeting. Otherwise, some committees doing it, some committees not doing it. I don't think that's a good way to go about it. I think we have to be consistent. Lorraine?
Are committees currently meeting in person, or are they meeting via Zoom still?
Some are in person, yeah.
And both, actually.
Both.
Yeah, both, yeah.
All right, well, I mean, I actually agree with Barb. I think unless, they're being held at the school, they're being held in a public place, I'm just here. Okay. I would like to see them still Zoomed. I think not everybody's, comfortable coming to public meetings still. I don't even like coming to these public meetings. And I certainly would like to have the opportunity to watch them via Zoom if I didn't want to come here and watch them in person, or be able to watch them later for people like that. A lot of these committees now are being held during the daytime, and I agree that people can't necessarily get to them. So I especially agree with
I agree that they're cumbersome, and also that we shouldn't burden the central office staff. But I'm on Lorraine's page more. Like, I like having the option of being able to Zoom, and I don't want to miss a meeting because I can't Zoom. If I don't know, we're still in a pandemic, so to me, I don't know, I guess it's really nice to, there's been a lot of times that we said, oh, let's go look back in the recording, and then we can do the bullet points from there. But there's a lot that's not captured in the minutes. You know, I think some of you have been doing this for a really long time, and my only experience up until recently was Zooming. So I like the Zoom option, you know, with the current numbers. Our particular county is low, but, you know, if it just seems like it should be an option until we're a little bit further along in the pandemic. I work in healthcare, my son's in a local school, and so the likelihood of me getting through the year without having a quarantine is pretty low, and I don't want to have to setting it up at the last minute just to accommodate one person. And also because we're not following a structure where, oh, the committees are going to just meet before the board meeting, it's all different times of day. Sometimes the only way I can participate as a committee member is by Zooming. So I do think that we need to consider that, you know, like, it's not equity exactly, but like accessibility, that not only of our board, but of the community. And we've talked a lot about transparency, and even if 0 people look at it, it's still there. And there's no way they can say, oh, you're not being transparent unless I get, you know, I know that I shouldn't have said that, misspoke, but you can accuse people of anything, but you know, if you have all your committee meetings recorded, then it's like, it's just out there, you know, and I know, knowing that I'm being recorded, I think more about what I'm going to say, and I'm always thinking like, you know, this isn't some private conversation, you know, but it is cumbersome, and I don't know how we sustain that and make it realistic to not have it take an extra 20 minutes every single meeting. Or if you have people who are, you know, public who's having trouble getting on, you know, and how much do we have any responsibility for helping, you know, a member of the public with technical difficulties? There's so many things that are a time suck with these virtual connections that, you know, managing expectations, but, you know, I'm not ready to see them go away personally, but I understand why, like, in person is better overall, but.
Suzanne?
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but since the governor's order has expired and we're no longer under the emergency order that he put out, or he had put out, public meetings, if a committee meeting is considered a public meeting, and we warn it, does not one person from that committee have to be sitting in the public location?
Yeah.
So, I mean, if one person is sitting here and no one else can make it, unless you're on your cell phone, which isn't a good thing, you're gonna have to Zoom. Either that or we're all gonna have to commit. So.
I agree, Zooming and recording. I guess I'm trying to. I'm sorry, I should have raised my hand. I'll wait.
Peter?
Just to kind of bring closure to this, if it's getting late, can we just sort of ask the central office to look over the options? Maybe it's a dedicated laptop with Zoom on it that moves from committee meeting to committee meeting. I don't know what it is. But it's a Zoom device. And just come back to Zoom.com. That might work.
Okay.
We're in this funny area where we're between when we were ordered, basically everything had to be on Zoom, and now we're under no order, but there's a certain responsibility that we had given the fact that it's not like COVID's gone away.
Right.
Mayor,
Yeah.
this equipment is available in here.
All right, well, let's not do that debate now. Then why don't you and Peter get together and come up with some solution that could bring consistency to it. The only thing that I want to make sure of is that what one committee does, all committees do, so that there's consistency and of expectation.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
And we have a facilities committee at 9:30 on Thursday morning.
No pressure. The last item that was requested to be put on this was consent agenda, and whether or not this board should move to a consent agenda process. And it's, why are you shaking your head, you know?
Because I didn't ask, you had said earlier for consent agenda, I didn't ask that. I asked for at the very end if we just, give feedback on how we did as a board. Consent agenda is something totally different than what I had asked for.
This came up in a conversation a while ago.
Months ago.
We talked about a consent agenda, and it was discussed at that meeting, at least this is my memory, might be fading a bit.
Because that's what the Hannaford board did.
Hannaford board is a different type of board, where governance.
But that's where, but that's where the conversation came from.
Where what came from me was at the very end of our, at the end of our board meeting, we do have a policy that we report back on, and it's just about how did we as a board operate together, and were we, did we follow our operating procedures, like did we all raise our hands, did we all communicate, be nice to each other? The money board does the same thing. That was the only piece that I asked.
Okay.
The consent agenda is where you would normally find items that occur every single time, and you can vote. You vote on your agenda for the board meeting, you approve them. If there's something in there like tonight with the minutes, then you have to vote to pull them out of it. And that wasn't the part I wanted. I just wanted to stick at the end.
But we had at that conversation, whenever that was, we had talked about, let's talk about that in the future. So that was something that was discussed when it came up, that let's talk about that at the board retreat, which is how it got onto the board retreat.
Where we are.
Yeah.
Barb.
Yeah, so I think we would have to, I think it would be good to look at it to see if it would really save us time. Because if we end up pulling it off to discuss it anyway, I looked it up, just to have a better understanding. And it basically says, well, if you have questions, then you send them to the person responsible, but then we'd be doing these dialogues, so everybody wouldn't be necessarily hearing it. So I'm wondering if it really in the end would save us time.
Sure.
We're a pretty efficient board, talking to other boards around that go 4 or 5 hours at times, including Mount Abe, which my daughter sits on. I think we're a pretty efficient board. We've been here now, yes, for a long stretch, but we usually don't go excessively over. So we would save so little time. And today is a definite example for us to present what we presented in the minutes and the whatever, the bills. We'd be adding another level to have to do that, and I don't think it would save us any time. I really don't.
Is there anyone here who wants to push forward a discussion on doing a consent agenda? Great, no.
Can I say that we have spent in the years that I've been on this board more time talking about doing a consent agenda than we've ever saved having done it.
Right, so we're not going to move forward on consent agenda. The conversation as to whether or not we have a discussion at the end of board meetings saying how did we do as a board meeting, why don't we put that also to the communications and engagement committee and bring up a specific recommendation as to how that can happen, and then we'll consider that as a board. So just at the end, how are we communicating and measuring our own effectiveness?
I just want to point out that where you see examples of that are generally on boards that use policy governance model, which we don't, and so it's worth sort of seeing if that model is used in non-policy governance areas.
Perfect. Great, thank you all very much. I appreciate that. Is there any other for other?
I have a quick question about, I don't know whether this falls under, the communication assignment that we have. So I noticed that the members of the public make comments in the Q&A, but we don't get to see them. So who gets to see those, and how do we respond to those? Like, what do we do with them? What's the
like right there?
Policy around them?
Open them, like always open them, just to always have them.
Right now, I mean, the challenge is that the structure of the board meeting does not change because there's Q&A on the Zoom meeting. And so they're utilizing a feature that Zoom presents, but it is not a function of a board meeting. the opportunity for them to make public comment needs to be in the public comment section of the meeting. And so a dialogue back and forth on chat technically is not part of a minute of a board meeting.
And I think one of those was just to say that they couldn't hear very well.
Yeah, that's a lot of times when I sit at home, when I look at those, it's like, we can't hear you, can you talk louder? And so,
But it's not an official record in any way of the board meeting.
Is there a way of disabling that feature?
Ken?
You can, yeah.
So that might be simple. We can take that on to figure out what we do with any Q&A functionality. Figure out what we have. All right, great. Anything else for other? Okay, motion to adjourn. Wow.
All do it once.
Mary, second.
Barb,
All right, great.
Hi, all.
Oh, thank you all. Thank you, Amy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.